Okay. Let's get started. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, which is part of the continuing series of the Greenwich Roundtable. Our topic this evening, contemporary philanthropy, is special for several reasons. It's the first time we've gotten together in over 3 years. We're back. And it's the second time in 28 years we've held a roundtable away from the Bruce Museum. So, very special. It's kind of comfortable. I can get used to this. It's a nice place, especially the lobby. And more importantly, it's a long overdue continuation of the series of philanthropy that the late Paul Newman had encouraged us to pursue with a grant. And so tonight we'll hear from two prominent thought leaders, two people doing God's work, so to speak, and a local practitioner who's quietly made a difference. I'll briefly introduce them after I say this. The speakers' views are their own and don't necessarily represent our views, the staff or the trustees of the Roundtable. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers this evening. Una Asili chairs the philanthropic research at Indiana University School of Philanthropy. She publishes the Global Philanthropy Tracker, the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, as well as the Giving USA report. She is the founder of Generosity for Life, and she chairs the school's signature project, the Philanthropy Panel Study, an examination of the generosity of American families over time. Sitting to our left, next to Peter, Kurt Soderlund is the tireless and long-serving CEO of the Safe Water Network, a charity he co-founded with Paul Newman in 2006. Safe Water works to provide clean drinking water to the world's poor who lack access. Safe Water Network establishes best practices, empowers communities, collaborates with NGOs, and works with governments to build off-the-grid water systems. Sitting next to Kurt's right, Peter Malkin is a Harvard-trained lawyer, a real estate pioneer, and by the looks of his property deals, someone who used the board game Monopoly as a blueprint for building one of the most successful real estate portfolios in Manhattan. Peter Malkin is the chairman emeritus of the Empire State Realty Trust and Malkin Holdings. He founded the Grand Central Partnership, the 34th Street Partnership, the Merritt Parkway Conservancy, the Greenwich Tree Conservancy, and Greenwich Green and Clean, amongst other things. More importantly, Peter is a tireless philanthropist and a role model for all who practice the craft. And our special guest this evening, Clya Newman, is Paul Newman's daughter, Kurt's wife and the head of the Serious Fund Children's Network. The Serious Fund Network is a network of camps that serves almost 500,000 kids in over 50 countries. It all started with Paul's Hole-in-the-Wall GAM camp. Clya is their ambassador, and she's offered to say a few words tonight. And I will start to stay quiet, but let me introduce our moderator who started this 17 years ago. To my left, your right. Bill Jarvis is our moderator, and it's a role he, again, held 17 years ago in our first session on philanthropy. Mr. Jarvis runs the philanthropy practice at Bank of America, formerly known as the U.S. Trust. And before that, he was the executive director of the Common Fund Institute and the Endowment Institute. And with that, please welcome Bill as he sets the table for us this evening.
Steve, thank you so much. That's the applause is all for our guests, and I'm going to get right into this because Una, as a result of family matters, has a hard stop at about 7 o'clock, and I want to be sure we have a chance to hear from her. Una, my partner for so many years in the studies that we've done of affluent philanthropy and other things. Tell us, in your view, what the table is to be set like for people who are thinking about philanthropy in this country. It's an area where there's been tremendous development, but also tremendous attention, changes that are intergenerational in nature, and also changes that are reactions to societal stresses and economic stresses. So, and for all of you, many of you will have, I hope, a copy of this paper, which if you refer to during Una's remarks will help you to be enlightened. So please go ahead.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. It is such an honor and a delight to be with all of you. I have so enjoyed this fantastic setting and meeting so many amazing leaders. Very quickly, I am at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. It's the world's first school on philanthropy. It was the first, but there are many others that are growing in many parts of the world. In my everyday job, one of the most fun things I get to do is actually learn how philanthropy is changing here in the US and around the world. And I'd like to share just some very quick highlights of what all the work we've done in the last 2 decades, what we've learned, and what that means for all of you. So let's start with the very big picture. The word philanthropy. How many people know what that means? I see some hands. Yes, it means the love of humanity. Along with that word, what we've learned is that in every culture, in every part of the world, in the US, abroad, we see generosity in every community. It's a value that Americans hold dear, but we also see it in so many parts of the world, every single corner of the globe that we study. Along with the concept, the word philanthropy, that word dates back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. There's a newer word that has been used in philanthropy, the word metrics, measurements. We all know that. Before COVID, there was a big push to measure philanthropy. And so we've joined these two powerful concepts, philanthropy, love of mankind, metrics, and we have a new word, philanthrometrics. I'd say that's what we do at the Lilly Family School. We bring the data to the love of humanity. And with that as an umbrella, I'd like to share the word metric is newer to the English language. The metric system didn't actually appear until the 1800s. Philanthropy is timeless, but the idea of measuring philanthropy is much newer. A lot of the data sets that we use in philanthropy, you have the Giving USA report, actually is the longest running report on philanthropy anywhere in the world, and it's only been around since the 1950s. So using that as a frame, I have every single Giving USA that's ever been published. I have them on my bookshelf in my office. And in the last few years, I found myself going back to the editions in the 60s and the 50s. And I'd like to share just how philanthropy has changed in the last 3, 4, 5 decades. First, let's look at the 1950s. Giving was much smaller. Today, giving is a big deal, we could say. The latest numbers, the philanthropic sector reached $480 billion. That is a new record. And we reached that record despite a global pandemic, an economic crisis of unprecedented proportions, and a global health crisis. As we look at all the giving that takes place in the US, the lion's share of all giving still comes from individuals, almost 70%. In the 1950s and 60s, just to give you a sense of this, almost 85-90% came from individuals. So there's been a big shift in the time period that we've been studying giving. We've seen the rise of foundations. Foundations now occupy almost 20% of that pie, as it were. Charitable bequests now make up about 8%. What's interesting is that corporate giving, which we hear a lot about, was about 5% in 1950. It's still 5%. But underneath that umbrella of 5%, corporations are becoming much more strategic about their giving. They're matching dollars through workplace giving programs. They're participating in cause marketing. We had a big discussion earlier today. Paul Newman was one of the pioneers in cause marketing with the Newman's Own salad dressings and so forth. So as we look at that pie, it's almost, you have the picture in front of you. We've seen tremendous change, but some things have stayed the same. Generosity remains a core value for many Americans. Giving has grown even in the pandemic. This is something that a lot of people find really surprising. Not only did Americans give more during the pandemic, the study Bill and I work on showed that average gifts increased by 40% by wealthy Americans. But we also saw people step forward with their giving. McKinsey Scott is often used as an example. More trust-based philanthropy, unrestricted gifts. The president of Howard University told me this story himself. He got a call that said she was going to make a $40 million gift with no restrictions, no strings attached, no requirements, no reporting. And this was it had never been done before, you could say. So we've seen large-scale donors give at that level, but also everyday Americans using all of these new tools and techniques. So that's one, the step up and the step forward. I also want to talk about technology. In the last few years, we've seen more Americans giving online. Today, online giving makes up 13% of all giving. That's an all-time high. There was an inflection point during the pandemic. More people gave through digital platforms. Crowdfunding really took off during the pandemic. As an example, the CDC Foundation, how many of you heard the CDC Foundation in the last few years? Yes. They started a new crowdfunding campaign. They had never done this before and raised $50 million in just a month. So technology is playing a key role, and it's playing a key role for all Americans. It's not just younger people anymore. It's also all Americans of all ages. My father just turned 80. And when I joined Instagram, which was just a few years ago, guess who was on Instagram before me? My dad. So my point is, it isn't just the younger generation that are using technology. And then the last point, and one that I think is very interesting, we're seeing new areas of giving really emerge. Giving to climate, for example, has become a top area for many young Americans. We're also seeing giving to racial and social justice. That wasn't a category until really 2020, where with the killing of George Floyd, many more Americans wanted to support that racial and social justice. Today, about 20% of Americans give to that area. So if I had to tie it all together, all this data that we collect, Giving USA, Bank of America High Net Worth Study, the Philanthropy Panel Study, what we've learned through more than 2 decades of collecting this data is that philanthropy is a core value for Americans. Despite all the changes we've seen, economic, health, and social and environmental, what we have found is that in this period, many Americans have leaned into philanthropy. The second big takeaway is technology is also leading to a lot of innovation in the field. And so many of us are learning these new tools as we speak. And then finally, as we look into the future of giving, I think what I will also say is the diversity in philanthropy, all the new tools that people are using, the new organizations that are being formed, but also the timeless values that families are bringing. One of the things I loved about our discussion earlier was just how families pass on those values. In our household, I'll share just a very small anecdote. We are very big on helping kids learn about philanthropy. And so when our kids were very young, we told them to forego their birthday gifts and instead ask their friends to donate to some charities of their choice. Now, how popular do you think we were as parents with that? Well, not very popular at first, but not only did they buy into this concept, but their friends started doing it too. And then when their friends had birthdays, they chose a charity and designated it. So my big picture takeaway from all the research we're doing is that this is a time of all-in giving. People no longer just want to write checks, especially younger Americans. They want to get involved. They want to give their time, their talent, their treasure, but they also want to bring their networks along. And that's another piece I drew from Paul Newman's story. He brought others to the table. So as we move into the holiday season, I guess a call to action for all of us is how can we be all-in givers? Certainly write the checks, but also think about ways of bringing others to the causes that matter to us. Bring our children, our young mentees, nieces, nephews, the people we work with. I think what we've learned during this period is that there are so many challenges in the world, but it's also been a time of a lot of inspiration because we've seen everyday Americans lean into helping improve their communities and their world. So I'll stop here and certainly turn it over to our moderator.
Well, Una, that's fantastic as a setting of the table. I want to pull on a couple things before I turn it over to our other panelists. One is you mentioned this idea of how not only the next generation, but many other more thoughtful philanthropists are not using that word donation anymore. Donation is you pitch the check over, you get your letter back. Instead, what you see often is the word investment. They think of this as an investment. And when you and I make an investment, you don't put it in and walk away. You come back and take a look and see how it's doing. And so this involvement is not simply a beginning point. It's actually a continuation of involvement, commitment, volunteering, serving on boards, and so on. The other point I'd like to make, and I don't want to be a downer here, is that I was expecting you to say this, but you didn't, so I have to. and that is that your Giving USA, the study on mass giving, as late as the year 2000, was showing very consistently over many decades that about 2/3 of American households gave to at least one charity on average. There was a break point that occurred with the global financial crisis. And as of the last year's Giving USA, unfortunately, less than half of American households are now giving to at least one charity. And that's because their balance sheets suffered grievously in the financial crisis and did not recover. And so when we think about philanthropy as not only a standalone, but as an actor and a factor, if you will, in the society that we inhabit, these social and economic factors cannot be ignored. And I don't know if you have, as a parting word, anything to say about that, but the consequence is, sitting here in Greenwich, Connecticut, that as you saw from this sheet, the total amount being given goes up every year, but the amount being given by the mass population is not, and participation is not. Therefore, it becomes incumbent upon people in towns like this one to be the ones who are supporting the charities, supporting the organizations that are making a difference.
I'm so glad you raised that point, because if I had to pick one data point that keeps me up at night, it would be that.
Yeah.
When I joined the faculty more than 20 years ago, this number was very stable. 2/3 of Americans gave. In fact, it only went up if we had a natural disaster, more people gave. Around the time, in fact, we said giving was recession proof because it didn't change very much. But the Great Recession changed a lot of things, and we started to see that number decline. Even when the economy rebounded, we didn't see that top line number go back up. And when we drill down and see who has stopped giving, it's mostly younger Americans and lower income households with less education. There are a lot of explanations. The economy is certainly part of it. Also, lower levels of trust in institutions is driving that, and also less religious affiliation.
Since much giving goes through religious institutions.
Exactly.
Yes.
The part that I think we can all own is the fact that younger Americans are less likely to participate. And all of us interact with young people every day in our families, in our workplaces, in our communities. And I've taken this as a bit of a charge. Personally, I shared our family story, but also thinking about what can we do to make giving easier. As we noted, a lot of young people ask, well, where's the Venmo option? Where's the Cash App? I want to donate, but I don't want to write a check. So we need to also create platforms that young people resonate with. And one really fun example of this is a platform called Omaze. You can bid on experiences while you're giving to charity. You can have OMAZE.
OMAZE, like a maze with an O.
Exactly.
Okay.
You can have lunch with the Clooney's, for example, while you're Amal and George, while you're donating to your favorite charity. So there are all kinds of innovations. This sector is ripe for innovation, and it's great to see young people really taking the lead in making giving more accessible, more fun, and more participatory as well.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you very, very much. And I will invite you to quietly take your trip. Godspeed, and thank you very much. So turning now to my left and to Kurt, we heard about environmentalism being an important, and climate being an important target of giving. We have here Safe Water. Tell us about your work. Tell us about how it got started, and where do you intend to take it?
Thank you. I think maybe a couple things just to try
Yeah,
and context.
please.
And so environment is one big issue. Of course, in the last 2-3 years, public health is a big issue. And the intersection between...
Flint, Michigan being the big news story there, but it's a more important thing across the board, isn't it?
Yes, and certainly COVID has reminded
Yes.
us just how important simple hand washing is.
Yeah.
How important safe water is. And you're right, Flint, Jackson, in our backyard, there's been issues that aren't but a stone's throw away around water and sanitation. So there's growing recognition, this confluence of climate change and this renewed appreciation for public health and the importance of water. It's any public health professional would put it at certainly top 3 issue globally for whether it's child health, maternity, women's issues, remarkably profound. There's 2 billion people 2 billion people around the world who don't have access to safe water.
Billion with a B.
Billion. And there's lots of money spent. There's failure points all over. About 30 to 60% of investment in water supply is wasted. The water systems underperform. They aren't sustainable. They don't deliver safe water reliably. And so there's this enormous public health issue. There's a lot of spending and there's a lot of inefficiencies in the marketplace. And so what we focused on at Safe Water Network is not the infrastructure, which has been the issue, the focus for many years, putting in water systems, but keeping the infrastructure running. And so the sustainable services, the last mile services of water supply. And that ranges from the local source water to water processing, conveyance, pipe water systems, the water quality assurance that's associated with that. And then to the lips, there's a whole number of hygiene practices that happen in the house to make sure that that water is safe. So we focused on 2 countries, Ghana and India. It's a global issue, but we focused on 2 and went really deep in those 2. And in 10 years, we've grown to be the largest private provider of safe water in the country of Ghana. And that,
Medium-sized country in Africa.
that's right.
Yeah.
And the reason why that's important is because it's something that the head of Gates Foundation India said to me very early. He said, Kurt, don't do another pilot. The world is littered with pilots. Whatever you do it at scale. Because if you can demonstrate something at scale, then you've really solved the critical challenges to sustainability. And so that's been our focus, is really get entrenched in a couple of countries and demonstrate its scale. There's a lot of talk about metrics and measures.
Right.
We invest very heavily. We're the only NGO crazy enough to have a P&L for every one of our water systems. I mean, no one does that. Now, why is that important? It's important because ultimately, if you don't have, we charge a little bit for the water, tiny amount. And if we are unable to collect the money to pay everybody in the value chain, it doesn't survive. So we take that very seriously. I'll say one. There's a lot of places this conversation can go, but I'll say one point on that I think is really interesting that maybe connect to some of the points about new philanthropy or new innovative forms of philanthropy. I'll try to link these 2 points. There's more and more focus on results-based philanthropy. So we just were awarded last week because of the data we collect, because of our ability to demonstrate that we have uptime of 95% or better, which is unheard of in the sector. This results-based funder is providing an award to us. In 2023, we have to report quarterly. If we continue to meet those, we're going to get about $700,000.
Wonderful.
And what's beautiful about it is that's going to be really important for our field programs, keep it running, but it's unrestricted.
Yes.
So they write
As
a
Una
check.
said, unrestricted is
You know what to do with the money better than any of us sitting in some office trying to monitor. So we want one measure. Prove that you can do it, keep it running, 95% or better, and then you figure out what to do with the money. And I thought, that's a brilliant way of doing philanthropy in a way that makes sense.
So I want to dig in a little bit. Let's leave India to one side, big complex country, but how did you choose Ghana? What was it when you found it, and what did you do to make it the success that it is? And I'm sure you've told this story, but I think everyone would love to hear it.
Yeah, so we were focused on we did a big review, big study. Deloitte actually did a lot of work for us. We narrowed it down to 4 countries that we thought were interesting. Ghana, India, Bangladesh, and Kenya. And we started in 4 countries. Kenya and Bangladesh, enormous need. I'd love to be working there, but we just weren't getting the right kind of traction, the right kind of partners. So we said, let's just really go for Ghana and India. Why Ghana? And why those 4 countries? So big need. Frankly, they're English speaking, English law. And so it was easier for us to think about how to navigate those requirements. Not that should forever be a criteria, but in terms of getting started, they aren't the most complex, most fragile, but they are very fragile markets and very, very challenging. So we felt like we could get some wins there. We had what we thought was a very good local partner, and being able, we've talked about networks before, having strong partners and capabilities in country was important. So it was a combination of factors that led us to place what was at the time a fairly small bet, and then we got traction and we continued to reinvest.
Now, identifying partners must have been a challenge, and securing the initial funding to be sure that you could, don't want to use the word pilot project, but be able to show that you could achieve this and scale it up. How did you do that?
Well, it helps when you've got someone like Clea's father.
Just checking.
Yeah, and so I
Knew there
wouldn't,
was a reason.
I wouldn't suggest that, but he was important, not just in providing funding support,
Yes.
but we ended up, and Peter is part of founding, which I'm sure he'll speak about, a committee encouraging corporate philanthropy. So a group of some 200 CEOs of very large corporations, of which Paul and Peter had a very big hand in founding many years ago. And it was Paul's view, which I think speaks to the funding and the resourcing. His view was, well, we've created this terrific organization. Now it's time to show the world we can do something. And it's insufficient just to measure our impact and congratulate each other for our brilliant philanthropy and corporate social responsibility. So he was very impassioned about showing how we can do something. Regrettably, the organization didn't pick it up as a project, but we got for PepsiCo, Deloitte, there were a couple of others that early on played an important role in helping us get started. So that was an important part of providing, and it was funding, but it was also expertise that helped us.
So now we see you come to a country like Ghana. It has a legacy water environment, let's call it. How do you diagnose what to do and decide what to do first and what to do next, and get the allies? I mean, without local partners, you're not going to get anything done.
Well, it's like those stories where if you knew what if I knew what I
Yeah, you wouldn't.
I arrived with a suitcase and a couple phone numbers.
Sure.
And started calling people who had been doing water projects. And it's, there's a lot of activity. It's a very fragmented sector. There's too many NGOs, frankly, and that's part of what we're trying to, Safe Water Network is in our name for a reason, which is we're working to organize this fragmentation and a bit of chaos. We started doing, we really, I'm going to try and do this short, but there's three things that we do. One
Take
is,
your time. It's okay.
yeah, one of them is we do the field programs on the ground, so operating at scale. The other is we build out the tools, the resources, the practices that make it possible to run and operate and demonstrate with the data, the information, the insights. We test, we innovate, we're constantly testing.
Because
new
you've got a big city, a couple big cities, and you've got a profoundly rural economy as well.
Yeah.
And the same solution probably doesn't work for.
So you've got a variability in the solution, and then the third pillar is advocacy and working with governments and
I
policy.
wonder where the government comes in here.
So now, why is this in terms of navigating that territory? And I'll think maybe I'll tell it through one of my first meetings with the Rural Water and Sanitation Agency, which is early days. And they kept asking me, God, there's so many water NGOs here. Why do we need another water NGO in Ghana? And what I talked about was what we're going to do is be the innovators. We're going to test new things. We're going to try new things. We're going to create this test bed for continuous innovation. We're going to document and bring the data. And it's like a light bulb went off, and it was basically that we can be their R&D engine for the government.
Interesting.
And that's played. I mean, they really look to us as being a resource for improving operations, improving water quality, measuring and market mapping. So there's a real service that we're providing beyond the implementation of water systems.
Sure, and that since it's a big country, I would infer from what you're saying that enables you to tell the government we're sort of 80% to where we need to be here, but here we're only 40%. Let's, here's what we would need to get to 80, that kind of thing.
I mean, so we've invested heavily in a digital platform over the past 4 or 5 years. The government has finally agreed to start using it.
Well done.
And the interesting story here is 4 years ago, a development agency put in $4 million for the government to develop a digital platform.
And
it was developed by a bunch of techies who never operated a water system before, and it's not used today. And what we call this is it's a digital platform built by operators for operators.
Okay.
And it helps them measure performance. And,
So you have what I would call water people in your
yeah.
you must have started with a cabinet of people, and then you had people who were local, and the cabinet of people got with the people who were local, and there were
100% of
Yeah.
our team in Ghana is from Ghana. 100%.
Cool.
I recruited a guy out of PepsiCo. I always think of the John Scully, Steve Jobs,
Yeah, right.
legendary interview. Said, "What are you going to sell? Sugared water for the rest of your life?"
Right,
And he came and joined Apple.
Right.
And that was the same pitch to Charles Namako, who's a terrific partner, and because in these countries, water is a profound issue.
Yes.
Profound. These people will talk about as a child how they spend an hour, 2 hours a day fetching water.
Just getting water. Yeah.
And that continues the next generation in certain places in the country.
Yeah.
So it's this country, we don't really equate it in the same way.
Well, and water also the source of endemic diseases and public health issues and so on.
Yeah.
Before I know we want to hear from Peter, but we've talked about Ghana. India is huge. India is diverse. India is vast. How are you doing this in India?
India's, every time you think you start to understand India,
Yeah, right.
I come back and say, oh my God, it is 15 countries wrapped into one. Amazingly complex, deep cultures and complexities that I yet to unpack. I will say that there's a couple things. One is, for the same reasons we're being successful in India, the governments need help around these exact same issues. And so we built credit. We had a large project with USAID that we're just 3 years, and we're just kind of closing out to help the government around water, but all grounded in the experience that we have from operating at scale in 3 states in India.
Oh, you work state by state then?
Yeah, it's a state subject.
That's what
so you
I
have
think
to.
you'd have to, right? Okay.
But I will say, earlier I met with one of the very large industrial families, and we were talking about, and this is my counterpoint to data, and which is I think it's like a two-headed monster. So on the one hand, data can be terrific if you're looking at operational performance. If you're trying to figure out how are you going to change systems, how are you going to change policies, how are you going to actually drive new ways of operating. So I was meeting with this very wealthy industrial family member, does a lot of philanthropy. And he says, Kurt, whatever you do, understand that in India, it's, and I forget exactly how I described it, but there's no straight lines. You are forever, you're going here and then you're turning, and all you want to know is the trajectory. You're getting roughly where you want to go, and you're going to keep course correcting, and you will get there. But if you're trying to measure that, you can't. You just cannot measure it. So you've got to trust this combination of partners. You've got to trust instincts. You've got to have a tolerance for ambiguity. And I think part of the challenge in philanthropy can be, because there are some organizations that tilt too heavily on the metrics and the measures, and a lot of success is dependent upon managing ambiguity.
And when we come back to Claia's remarks, I'm sure that will be part of what you talk about. But Peter, please riff on what we've heard. You have a lifetime of experience with this. Share with us your perspective, please.
Well, first, thank you for having me here. And when Steve McMenamin calls, you come. And then to find out that it was together at this table with Claia and Kurt, that was very special. In 2006, Paul Newman gave a grant that underwrote the first talk on philanthropy to the Greenwich Business Roundtable. And I will tell a bit of the story about that. I did want to comment one thing. Una said philanthropy is worldwide. Well, actually, it's not. Philanthropy is a typically American tradition. Most countries look strictly to government to take care of everything. About 20 years ago, the chairman of Mitsubishi, whom I met because he was leading the establishment of a Japanese school for the children of Japanese executives who were living in and around Greenwich, so that when they went back to Japan after their 3 to 5 years, their children could segue into the top private Japanese schools. So they had to have an equivalent Japanese education here. Most of it conducted in Japanese. It was kind of interesting that they took over a property that had been where my wife went to school, which was Rosemary Hall School before it moved up to Choate, removed back to Choate. So he sent me and Isabel over to Japan. And for 2 weeks, we went from the northern end of Hokkaido to the southern end, speaking to Japanese businessmen. And first of all, he told me, if their eyes are closed and their head is down, they're listening. But don't let that stop you. But in Japanese, there is no, or was no word for philanthropy. It just did not exist. And this is true also in France and Germany, the European countries you expect. And it's interesting because Kaya knows that setting up camps in different European countries to get people to support them privately is quite special. So that's the first comment I had. The second comment is that the School of Philanthropy that Una teaches at and the Lilly Foundation, Lilly Professor, uses mostly the metric information provided by the Committee Encouraging Corporate Philanthropy, now called the Committee Encouraging Corporate Purpose. There's a great story, Steve said be personal, be narrative, so I'll tell a couple of stories
Please.
if I may. In the 1970s, my late father-in-law, Larry Ween, said he saw that the great wealth families were basically dying out, giving out. The new tech billionaires had not arrived yet. And he decided that what was needed was to get corporations to be more philanthropic, more interested in what we now call sustainable or cause-related or just philanthropy. And so he set up a committee. And interesting, John, one of the members of the committee was your dad, John Love Sr. And the committee was wonderful. They met once a year for lunch and had a wonderful time. And then he and his secretary went off, and in the name of the committee, he bought stock in 300 companies. Not a lot of stock, but enough that he could go to a meeting. And at each of these companies, he got up with Sister somebody or other doing something else, and he gave a talk about, as a shareholder, I would like the company to be more philanthropic, be more socially responsible. He actually had written to the chairs of each of these companies, letting them know he was going to come and do that. And some of the people in our law firm filled in because he couldn't do 300 himself. But it was interesting. The reaction was Bill Moore, the chairman of Bankers Trust, came to see him and said, "This is wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this. It's going to be very helpful." And then a young man who founded one of the early computer companies said, "If you don't stop this, I'm going to sue you." And so there was a wide range of reaction. Well, he did this for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, the companies that he solicited had increased their annual philanthropic giving by $300 million. And then he said, "I've done it. That's enough." His children decided to set up a prize at Columbia called the Ween Prize in Corporate Social Responsibility. And the first year, the prize went to Merck because they gave out river blindness pills for nothing. And when the government couldn't do it, they did it. And the second or third year, forgive me, Chemical Bank was selected, and Walt Shipley. But one of the things was, by the way, that in order to get this award, the CEO had to come to Columbia and give a talk and then be presented with the award. This year that Chemical Bank got it for inner city lending, we decided that we would give a prize to a guy named Paul Newman because he gave 100% of his corporate profits to charitable causes. And so Walt Shipley and I and Paul Newman were sitting up on the dais. And just before I was supposed to give Paul his prize, he said, "Now I know it. You're the SOB who writes those letters to me." And I said, I looked at him like this. He said, "Well, it's about my plane. It's based in Los Angeles. It flies into Greenwich. And every time I come into Greenwich, you call the airport and say, 'It's noisy, and you're flying over my house.'" And actually, it was more than that because the governors of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut set up at my request, a tri-state aircraft noise mitigation committee. And we were to look at White Plains,
Yeah.
LaGuardia, JFK, Teterboro, and Newark. Well, so he didn't say SOB, by the way. He said son of a bitch. And so this was immediately where I was to introduce him. But he did say, "But you're right. We put hush kits on the engines." And it was very interesting. Well, then about 5 years later, I got a call from Paul Newman. And he said, "Since your father-in-law stopped his committee, I don't think the corporations are giving as much as they gave." And so I got in touch with the head of the conference board, who had been the academic dean at the Kennedy School, and they did a study for us. And what they showed was actually corporate giving was going up, but corporate profits were going that way. And so when Mr. Wien had set a goal of 2% of pre-tax domestic profit for philanthropic or sustainable, or call it what you will, it had been about 0.6% when he started. It got up a little over 1%. In any event, Paul said, "You've got to do something about this." And so I said, "Well, what? Okay, well, we'll set up something. We'll do something." He said, "But I'm not a real CEO." He said, "I just got popcorn and lemonade." He said, they won't talk to me." So I went out and I cold called David Rockefeller, Paul Volcker, and John Whitehead. And I met with each of them and I said, "Paul Newman and I want to do something that you believe in. Will you help us? Will you be the honorary co-chair of CECP?" And they all said yes. I mean, they didn't even know me. And so it was terrific. And then in the early years, Paul and Ben Cohn of Ben and Jerry and I provided the funding for this. But we decided that's not really a permanent thing. We had to, and we enlisted some CEOs, but didn't charge them anything. We had to beg them to join. And then I said, "Well, the real answer to this has got to be the Ford Foundation." So I said to Paul and John Whitehead, "Would you go with me to see the president of the Ford Foundation?" And they said yes. Well, I had tried 3 or 4 times to get an appointment, couldn't, but I finally I called, I spoke to the assistant to the president, and I said, she happened to be a lady named Susan Beresford, and I said, "Paul Newman and I would like to come and meet with the president." And she said, "Paul Newman?" And I said, "Yes." And we got to the Ford Foundation headquarters, and at the reception desk there were six women, where normally there would be one. And then another lady took us to the elevator, and then another lady took us to the president. And anyway, we went through this whole thing, and we spent an hour with her. And when we got finished, we had $2 million, $500,000 a year for 4 years. And as we walked out of the meeting, Paul put his glasses down like this and said, 70 is still sexy. So anyway, I have some wonderful stories about your dad that I'm sure you know a lot more than I do. But let me talk about my outlook on philanthropy. Mine is a very different one. Mine is is personal. I think that everybody in this room has an opportunity to be what Paul would call a force for good. Everybody in this room has an opportunity to assist local and regional and national organizations. My guide and mentor was my wife's dad, Larry Wien. When he grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, and that's an interesting story, by the way. Paterson, Jersey was founded by Alexander Hamilton to be the first industrial city in America, because he said unless America had industry, it could never get free of Great Britain because it was importing everything. And the Paterson Falls, very few people know this, are second only to Niagara. And they provided the power to run the mills well, in any event, in the 1920s, Isabel's dad's father had silk mills in Paterson, New Jersey. It was the big silk center. And there was a man named Barnard, and he was the mayor of the city. There's the Barnard Hospital. There's the Barnard Library. There's the Barnard City Hall. And he said that if you die wealthy, you wasted money. He said, take care of your family, do whatever you have to. But, I think as the alternative example, I was a lawyer for Harry Helmsley. He died, left $6 billion. And he never gave a penny away, except once or twice when Isabel's dad asked him. And so actually it's a major foundation now, and it's doing very good things.
And it's made some donations to Safe Water Network.
You got it. Okay. But the thing is, he never saw it. It's really, it was a great waste. Isabel's dad was at the same time chairman of the board of Brandeis, on the board of Columbia, vice chairman of Channel 13, vice chairman of the Institute of International Education, vice chairman of, about 5 different organizations, United Nations Association, United States. And he set a great benchmark. Una talked about how she talks to her children, and you all should talk to your children. Well, we did something very different. We set up for each of our 10 grandchildren a charitable fund. It happens to be at the Jewish Communal Fund, but it could be at the Westchester or Fairfield Community Chest or whatever. And every year they are asked to tell us what they give to. And they are told that they're expected to give away the income from these 10 funds. And we set a goal of 5% a year of the amount that we set up. And they have had to focus each year, but sometimes with a reminder from us, on picking charities that they think should be supported. And the things that they pick are fascinating. Some are health related to something in their family, preservation, mostly because they know their grandmother is so interested in historic preservation. But so this is an actual working thing. It's something that each of you could do. It doesn't take a huge amount of money to do it. But if you don't have the funds to set up a fund for designation, you could say, I'd like you to give, to designate some charities every year at the end of the year for me for X dollars. And your parents will give you to that charity for you, or will give you the money to give to that charity. And it really gets them involved in something. The Paul Newman and I story is, first of all, it was one of the great experiences for me to spend time with your father. He was really very simple about it, and basically said, you've got to do something. You've got to these corporate executives, and as I think Una or Jarvis said, we have now over 200 CEOs of public corporations that are members. Not only that, but their companies pay $15,000 a year for their membership. And we have a budget of $3.5 million a year, which is spent on metrics, measurement. We publish a report each year for different industries, the insurance industry, the banking industry, the retail industry. What do companies in those fields do? Compare. It's frankly sort of like when you go to recruit a CEO, you look and find out what everybody else is paying, and then you find out what you should be doing. And they get the individual companies are not identified, but their statistics are shown without their names. The result has been, I think, quite good. And actually, corporate giving, at least based on the statistics I'm getting, has been going up. And you would know better than I do, but I'm sort of remembering the last numbers I saw, how many billions of dollars a year. Some of it is cause marketing directly related to whether it's lemonade or something else, but some of it is specific where the company is giving something and they want to see the results.
Yeah.
The way you're talking about it, which I think is so good. And not only that, but we hold an annual meeting of contributions officers of these 200 companies. And by the way, most of them are ladies. And close to 200 show up, and they network, and they talk, and then they listen to CEOs who tell the story of what their company is doing this year. And each year we get very, very top people, whether it's the head of IBM or the head of big corporations through Goldman Sachs, the companies come and they talk about it. So from our own point of view, we've tried to, Isabel and I, to do local things, regional things, and national things. National things you give money to, but you can be involved, whether it's the National Trust for Historic Preservation, because this is a great interest that Isabel has. Nationally, we have locally in our community, as Steve mentioned, because Isabel noticed litter around the town, we started Greenwich Green and Clean to clean up the town, because we noticed that the trees that the Rockefellers had planted on Lake Avenue and other cross streets were dying. They were, a couple hundred years old at this point. We started the Greenwich Tree Conservancy. Well, the Greenwich Tree Conservancy has planted over 5,000 trees in Greenwich on the public roadways, schools, and public buildings. We're not involved in the private because Greenwich is very much against individual regulation of private property. But we really have created this. And what's really quite exciting to me is we have built an endowment from general contributions of almost $1 million, so that when we're not here, this can continue. Merritt Parkway Conservancy is something many of you may not even know exists, but we were very concerned. There were crazy proposals in the legislature. Widen the highway, add another few, but they completely overlooked that 67 bridges that would have to be changed, billions of dollars, and destroying what was a national historic roadway. And then when the state made a deal with the sandwich company, I'll think of the name of it, but the
Subway.
Subway. They basically leased all of the service areas on every highway in Connecticut to Subway. And the deal was that Subway didn't pay anything to get it, but they had to remove the old tanks. They had to do other things. And the deal was that Subway, the group that did Project Services, which did it, would get a certain amount of money, and anything above that would be shared with the state. And then we saw the designs for the service areas, and they were going to destroy all the service areas in the Merritt Parkway, and we stopped it. And then the Department of Transportation was going to build a $100 million intersection at Route 7 and the Merritt Parkway, going 3/4 of a mile to a dead end, because this plan had been created in 1950, and the towns of Reading and Wilton and Richfield had said you can't put that road through. So, but they were going to do it because the federal government came up with the money, or 90% of the money. And the Department of Transportation in Connecticut, nobody controls it. The only thing is the governor appoints the members periodically. But we couldn't get anybody to stop it. So I brought a lawsuit in the federal district court. And it was kind of fun because the state was defended by the Attorney General. The Attorney General at that time was our son-in-law. He had to recuse himself from doing it. And the Assistant Attorney General came in, and there is a federal law that if federal money is used on an historic designated property, the government must prove that it has explored all the alternatives to do the least damage. And we got into the federal court, and the Assistant Attorney General was defending the state. And the judge, who was really very good up in New Haven, said, well, the law requires that you have explored all the alternatives. Did you? She said, yes, sir, we did. And he said, well, what were they? And she said, well, either this plan or leave it as it is. He said, that's not enough. So we got an injunction against the state of Connecticut, stopped that. Well, now, 18 years later, they're still working on that interchange. And they now are down to two choices, and they do consult with us now, because once you sue somebody, I don't know, I don't want to sound like Donald Trump, but once you sue somebody,
It gets their attention.
it gets attention. So these are things that I see as opportunities for members of this group. And Steve has said that our presentation tonight is going to be videoed and distributed to a large number of Greenwich business people or Greenwich area business people. And I hope the message will come across. You can do great things. You can do a water project, really fantastic. You know, Houston had no water for several days. Houston, Texas, America. Flint, we all have read about. So it's not just Ghana and India, although those desperately need it. And then individually, every one of us can do things, get involved. And the last thing I'll say is that when we moved to Greenwich in 1966, Isabel's dad said, the first thing you want to do is get involved with the United Way. Get involved with some local charities. That's where you'll meet the nicest people. That's where you'll meet the people who care, who are interesting. And so I'll leave that lesson and just say, I think this is personal opportunities that each of us has, and hopefully we'll follow through. Sorry I took so long.
No, Peter, what a wonderful story, and a series of stories. Thank you for sharing those. When we were talking before we got started, I promised Clea that she would be the maraschino cherry on the sundae. And I think we built a triple decker here.
It's a very big cake.
So Peter, ordinarily I would drill down into some of the things you said, but we'll have time for that afterwards. Clea, the thread that we've woven tonight runs through your life, and you're even up to the present day. And so perhaps you could reflect on some of the things you've heard and talk about the activities that you're pursuing now.
Let me see where to start.
And you have a book,
Well,
which is important to know about.
The book is on my father, but and the docuseries is on my parents.
Right.
But I would say that what's interesting about everything that I've heard is really people are interested in giving back. They are. The people want to help. If you're a good person, you want to help other people. You see somebody fall down, people want to help them pick them up, right? And the one thing that I will say that my parents did a beautiful job doing was when I was a little girl and I would have a bad day, all my girlfriends would go out and they'd go shopping. And my mother would say, well, honey, if you have a really bad day, the best thing to do is actually do something nice for somebody else. And that started when I was very little. And it basically continued exponentially until I'm doing what I'm doing now. But
Are
both
there that
of
many
my
bad days?
No, but I'm just saying in that that I learned to from my parents and my family and the people I cared about that find your passion, find the things that as my parents used to say to me, feed your soul. It may not be your job. It may be something other than your job, but ultimately it will feed your soul every day. And I've done lots of different things in my life, but one of the greatest joys that I do now is that I'm the ambassador for Serious Fun Children's Network, which started with our first camp, Hole in the Wall Gang Camp, in 1988. And when my father spoke here in 2006,
Yes.
he talked about, at the time we had 5 camps in the US, we had a couple in Europe. There was one coming online in Israel, in Japan. We were starting some partner programs in India and Africa for children with HIV. Now, in 2022, we have 30 camps and programs around the world. We serve 150,000 children and their families globally, all free of charge. Our programs are not just the summer. Most of our camps run almost year-round. And I have the joy of being the ambassador for our camps. And I travel all over the world, supporting them in all different kinds of ways, and picking children up that have fallen down. It's just one, it was that message that I learned when I was a very little girl. It's choking me up just because I can hear my parents saying it. But it does. It makes, I remember my dad saying, it'll make you feel better. And it does. I mean, I go to sleep every night feeling pretty good about what I do. I'm certainly not going to get rich doing it, but I will say that my mental heart wealth is huge, and there's something to be said for that. And just as one side note, both of my parents were inspirational. I mean, they just were. They were inspirational to numerous different people for all different reasons. As their child, they inspired me to do things that I was passionate about. And they never once said to me, you can't do this, you got to do that. They would always direct me and say, if that's what you want to do, honey, go do it, and do it with fervor. Just absolutely do it to the best of your ability. And that is a wonderful lesson, because it doesn't hold you back. And I'm really grateful for that. And if there's, going back to the business side of it, one of the most spectacular things that Dad started with Newman's Own is that he started a thing called the Community Partners Program, which was literally bringing in everybody within the community of Newman's Own. And that meant all the employees, all the people, all the guys who made the popcorn and the you know, the salsa and the dressings and
Right, right,
everything, along with all of the family members. And he said, listen, you know, I can't pay you a ton of money doing what you're doing, but I want you to be a part of this company. And I want you to enjoy philanthropy and giving back and give to the things that, you know, that mean something to you. It can be a local thing. It can be, you know, the environment. It can be climate. It can be children. It can be hospitals, your church, whatever it is. And Dad said the greatest thing about that was that he learned from that, that he took that all in, and that he didn't need to have a huge, you know, back office researching and whatever, because he had all of the people who cared about the company going out there and learning and giving to things that meant something to them, and his children included, and his friends and their children. And that was truly an inspiration, seeing how it worked. And there was never a point where it didn't work, where it wasn't, you know, my dad would say, what absolutely mesmerizes me is the fact that if you say to somebody, I'm going to give you $25,000 to give away, you know, do something that means something to you, he couldn't believe how seriously everybody took it. And including me when I first started, and I was a, nutty early 20s person who was only interested in my own stuff. And even I was, would spend hours and hours and hours researching things. And that, I think, is the trickle out that really means something in the long run. And if there was ever a legacy for my father, it would be that. It would be inspire others to give back. Because that's where you leave something.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Very,
Totally.
very moving. And I'd like to tie this together before we open the floor for questions. Una's coming from the point of view of her school, which is called a School of Philanthropy. Peter, you correctly, I can say as a student of history, and also to some extent a global traveler, pointed out that philanthropy as we know it is an American phenomenon and invention. But Una used another term, generosity. And I think we can agree that generosity, as you describe it, whether it has a structure in a philanthropic venture or not, is a universal human
it goes back to de Tocqueville
emotion.
when he came here.
Yes, exactly.
in the 19th
Right. Tocqueville was
century.
right.
And he said he saw things being done by Americans
Yes.
that French would never think of doing.
Right, right, because it was all supplied by the state.
And I want to tell one little story, a Paul Newman story, because it really goes with what Clive said. When Isabel's dad was an early supporter of the first camp, and in the end of 1988, he was dying. And one of his grandsons, our nephew, was at his house in Westport. They were a quarter of a mile from your folks. And all of a sudden, this motorcycle pulled up, and a guy in a leather jacket got out, came to the front door, and he had a jar of sauce and some, I can't remember what.
Salad dressing, whatever, right.
And our nephew said, "My God, it's Paul Newman." And he said, "Won't you come in?" He said, No, just please give this to Mr. Lee." And then he got on his motorcycle and drove away. And that is really personal. It's really,
Lovely
That's
story.
who he was.
yeah.
So we have some time before we break up, and we have such an interesting panel, and you are such an interesting audience, so I'm sure you've got some questions to ask or thoughts you'd like to share. So please, don't be shy. John Griswold, yes, our board chair.
Question for Peter. When you started with the business group, was there already a pattern amongst some of them to give generously, or was this really starting from ground zero?
There were matching gift programs where, if our workers give, we'll match. There were no really, I don't think any really thought through things. One of the things that Isabel's dad started was that with your annual report, there should be a separate philanthropic report.
Yeah.
Something that goes with it. To hold people to market. The answer is no. And frankly, having John Whitehead, who was recent chairman of Goldman Sachs, and Paul Volcker and David Rockefeller and Paul Newman, we got these people to do things.
Four horsemen.
Yeah. So it was really, it was something new.
Yeah, and actually, you mentioned 2%. You said that the corporation sort of rose up to the point where they got to 2%. And that set a light bulb off in my head because Una didn't mention this, but sort of decade in, decade out, at the mass level in this society, we give away about 2% of GDP. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. So all you were trying to do was to get corporations to rise to the level of the society that they were supposed to be serving.
And I tell you one other thing that I learned initially from Isabel's dad, and thought lower income people gave a larger percentage.
Disproportionately, yes.
Than wealthy people did. And a lot of that was through United Way or United Fund or whatever, church, Force Church, religious things. It was fascinating to hear Una say basically that one of the reasons individual giving has gone down is fewer people are involved in organized religion. There are some who are very organized, and there's some, but the vast majority are not.
Yep.
The big things that individuals traditionally have given to have been religion and health.
Yes, and we see that in our studies. We see basic needs, religion, health, and education.
Education,
Those
I
are
was
the
going to
ones.
say,
Yep.
is the third.
Yep.
Is the third. But we in this room have choices. We can do different things. We don't have to do what everybody else does. And I think that's the Paul Newman creed that I believe in.
Yeah. Other comments, other questions? Maybe what I'll do is hand it back to Steve, and we can mingle for a while for sure here. Oh, yeah, John, go ahead.
There he goes again.
One of the reasons that the United States succeeds in generosity by all these people and the corporations included, in some respects, I don't know what their deductions are, but they do get some tax advantage for giving to charities. I assume I've never been blessed with being able to give away money by a corporation. Is there a tax advantage in any of the countries you've worked in that would have gotten your attention?
Well, I think part of that question is, did the local people give to you, or is it all coming from here?
So, well, it's a combination, but both of it is coming from here in Europe. India mandated under Modi about early in his first administration what's called 2% again, 2%. CSR tax, that's what colloquially called. And then there's been increased, over the years, it's been actually quite a bit of conformance with it, compliance and reporting. And that's changed things. It wasn't as quick and immediate as you might hope, but that they've got reporting and auditing around it is starting to take more traction. And that's both for multinationals that have business units, profitable business units operating in the country, as well as the local corporations of some scale. So it is both, the multinational U.S.-based players as well as in country.
Yeah, John, I've got a couple responses to that from our own work. One is that in most countries, until very recently, looking at the American model and desiring to have the state take less of a role in provision of social services, many particularly developed countries have put in tax favoring of one kind or another for charitable gifts. The UK, for example, only did it in the last 20 years. And before that, my father-in-law, who went to Oxford, never gave a dime. He said, I'm all over that. But then once they started, there was a little bit. On the other side of it, though, this study of affluent philanthropy, of which I'm the editor, for many, many years, we've done it since 2006, has asked the question of the wealthy families, and these are people with an average net worth of 35 million. They're people who are major donors. What would change in your philanthropy if the tax deduction were eliminated or the estate tax were eliminated? And 75% say, nope, wouldn't change at all. And so, of course, and we ask, what are your considerations? They'll say, well, tax is in there. It's in, it's number 8 out of 15. It's not the last, but it's not a major driver. And so those who say, oh, they only do it for the tax deduction, it's kind of in the mix, but it's never a primary consideration.
It's had some major gifts since that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's, yeah.
As generous as the US.
When before the Japanese bubble burst, and Japanese companies were coming here and setting up business, Minoru Makihara, who was the head of Mitsubishi, and who was the man I mentioned before who set up the Japanese school in Greenwich, he spoke to the heads of the different companies, and he put it very crossly. He said, "You're going to do business in the United States, you got to give money."
Right.
I mean, Americans expect their people they pay for products to do something, either in your local community or so on. And so 5 or 6 major Japanese companies set up foundations.
I was going to go there, yes.
Based on that.
Yeah.
They weren't doing it in Japan, but
No.
they were doing it here because it was cause-related.
Yeah.
They were expected to live up to the standard.
And actually, having lived in Japan for a fairly long period of time and having business school friends who were Japanese, when they got together as alum, they didn't get together to raise money for the school. They got together to raise a beer and have a nice time and say, wasn't that great? But just to wrap up here, because I know we have a schedule to honor for some of you, corporate foundations are on the rise. Historically, corporate foundations would simply have been pass-through vehicles where the company would donate products or they would give a certain amount for corporate social responsibility, this kind of thing. Now, in our work at Bank of America, we see companies coming to us and saying, we want to set up endowments. We want to be more stable with this. And it's interesting to see it coming partly through the lens of next gen, but partly also through this lens that you're describing, I think, Peter, of coming to understand that the company cannot exist separate from society. It is in society, it benefits from society, it has to be there as a permanent thing.
And young people today are more interested in working for companies that do good things.
Yes.
We got to get them to go back to work altogether, but especially, but that's definitely a hiring issue.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And it's important. And there is some belief, at least John Whitehead believed, that companies that have a good public image, product sells better and stock does better.
So-called conscious consumerism, yes, very much on the rise. So at this day, I'll hand it back to Steve.
Oh my God.
To pipe us out. Thank you.
But it's a heavy burden, and I will keep it short. But when Paul was here, our speaker at the time was Bill Zabel, and this is probably something that Isabel's father had said, but it goes something like this. When you give, when you're alive, it's like gold. When you give, when you're sick, it's like silver. When you give away, when you're dead, it's like lead.
Oh.
And with that, have a wonderful evening.
Thanks to
Let's
our-
meet again next week.
Thanks to our speakers.